One day, when Countess Cassis was present while he was dressing, the emperor showed him the bayonet scar he had received during the siege of Toulon, which had almost cost him his leg. I told him that an officer on board the Northumberland had told me with some pride that it was an Englishman who had been the first to wound Napoleon and had hit him in the knee. I had answered him that this wound was still visible and had been received at the very moment when, with his own hand, he was taking General O'Hara prisoner. Although people thought I was not, replied the emperor, I was just as vulnerable as the next person. The emperor had heard that my bedroom was arranged with great taste. Knowing that he had gone out, I had gone upstairs to attend to a few things when someone knocked at my door. My embarrassment was great to see the emperor and Countess Cassis, who accompanied him. But, he said on entering, it is not cleanliness. It is elegance. It is like the private apartment of some young mistress. Is this where all my riches are locked up? Come, open the dressers. They must not be very considerable. However, on seeing them, he was surprised to be so rich. He complimented me on the neatness of what he saw there, and seizing 2 pairs of spurs, asked me which were the oldest. I pointed to one set, and he said he had worn them during the Dresden campaign. Very well, he said, taking them and handing them to Las Casas. These are for you. Sire, replied Monsieur de Las Casas, bowing deeply, I have only one regret, and that is not being able to do anything to earn these. I have only my love and my devotion left. Both belong to your majesty. As he was descending my small staircase to leave, the emperor said to him, What is the Grand Marshal doing today? Could he be ill? Why did he not bring me his work? I think, my dear, that it will be necessary for you to call your son, as your eyes no longer allow you to write under my dictation. It will train him for a task he will have to get used to. But Novaraz, who was at the foot of the stairs, told him that the Grand Marshal was in the drawing room. He went in and told Countess Casas to go out for a walk. Around the end of December, ships arrived from the Cape and from Europe. The Doris brought from the Cape 2 fine horses for the emperor. One, called Bonaparte, in that town, had won prizes in several races there. He was christened Numida at Longwood. Newspapers and letters were on board. Although they were 3 months old, they were nevertheless anxiously awaited by those who hoped to receive them. Only those who have endured the suffering of captivity can understand how much the soul is moved by the memory of family, and what feeling of happiness is generated at the thought of the consolation to be brought by a letter from a mother or a sister. Those that the emperor received from Madame Mère and Princess Pauline, whom he loved so much, must certainly have awakened painful memories in him, for he remained sad and thoughtful all afternoon. The admiral, who had presented himself several times without being received, took advantage of this circumstance to be received when he announced he was carrying these 2 letters. When leaving the emperor, he asked his permission to introduce him to the daughters of a British admiral who had died in India and who were returning to Europe. The emperor granted this. These ladies, like all the other people who had been introduced to him under similar circumstances, took away with them the memory of great misfortune and that of the great courtesy that had been extended them. There came a time, however, where he refused this kind of request. He said he did not wish that in Europe they could believe that at Longwood he was surrounded by great courtesy and care, when on the contrary he was suffering the harshest of captivities. It was in this vein that one day, in a bad mood, he told the Grand Marshal, to whom all foreigners who wished to be introduced had to submit their request, Answer them that dead people do not receive visits. On one of the ships arriving from Europe was Captain Piontkowski, whom I had known in the Polish squadron on Elba, commanded by Colonel Yermanovsky. The emperor hardly remembered him, but the Grand Marshal told him who he was. The emperor could not understand how this officer had managed to obtain permission from the British government to be sent to St. Helena without his having asked for him, whereas he had been refused the right to bring with him men he would have liked to have. When this officer came to Longwood, brought by the admiral, he was wearing the uniform of ADC. The emperor was hurt by this and said to the Grand Marshal, "What does this uniform mean? He was never my ADC. Tell the admiral I shall not see him." Then, after a few seconds' reflection, he decided he would receive him after all. That evening, the emperor received him kindly and told me, as if he was going to bed, that he would have preferred such a favor had been granted to an officer who could offer him resources that he would not find in this one. He told me to give him 500 francs to pay for his first necessities and to pay him 250 francs every month. Captain Piontkovsky ceased wearing the uniform of an ADC and resumed the uniform of the corps to which he belonged. He was quartered in a tent close to Dr. O'Meara and the captain of the guard while waiting to be housed under a tar paper roof. The feelings of devotion and respect that on August 15th had led these gentlemen to celebrate the emperor's birthday on board the Northumberland led them to also celebrate January 1st, 1816. The horizon had not gotten any better since that time. The emperor tried to make the state less gloomy by bringing an air of gaiety to the heartfelt wishes of each of them. Children had their turn, and he gave them some New Year's gifts and spent part of the morning being amused by their childish pleasure. After lunch, he got into his carriage and invited Captain Piontkovsky to accompany him. No matter how much care the emperor took to distract himself with work, and no matter how many horseback rides he took within the boundaries or around the island with the Grand Marshal or General Gourgaud, there were still many moments when painful thoughts haunted him. He would then say his enemies would have been less barbaric had they had him shot rather than bringing him to St. Helena. His mental suffering must have been great. The restrictions imposed on him were also a source of aggravation. One would have thought that a conversation between the emperor and the admiral, following a luncheon where the latter expressed a desire to please him and to improve the state of affairs, would have brought the admiral to get rid of the duty officer during the emperor's excursions outside the boundaries. But this never happened. The only change he made was to order Captain Poppleton to follow the emperor dressed in civilian clothes instead of in uniform. It was not the uniform that displeased the emperor, but the constant surveillance made of his speech or his actions by the person wearing it. He had maintained the habit of questioning people he met. Monsieur de las Casas was his interpreter, but he could not do so without the duty officer knowing about it, since, without being close to him, he had orders never to let him out of his sight. Even his generosity towards a few unfortunates was halted for fear it might compromise them. If he had been free in his actions, he would have liked to enter cottages he encountered along his way, to talk about farming with some, to know the needs of others, and to offer financial help where it was needed without it being known. The memory of a good deed associated with one of his outings would have made him cheerful when he returned. One day, when everything had been prepared for a small excursion to one of the farthest points on the island to have lunch, the emperor was about to get on his horse early in the morning. A pack horse with canteens had been prepared by General Gourgaud, who, wishing to surprise the emperor, cut up a large leather bag and succeeded in making a saddlebag, similar to the ones that had contained the emperor's meals in the army. Preparations had been kept secret. The emperor hoped to mount his horse, gallop away, and escape the surveillance of his guardian. But the moment he was about to get on his horse, he was told that Captain Poppleton was already in the saddle, prepared not to let him out of his sight as he had done a few days before. When this was reported to the emperor, he abandoned the excursion, and the horses were sent back to the stables. The time he spent dressing was allotted to Dr. O'Meara to come and see the emperor. One day, the doctor told the emperor he had been told in town that the emperor handled the plow no less well than the sword. They had learned how, seeing the East India Company farmer cutting furrows in a field to plant wheat. He had gotten off his horse to cut a furrow himself and astonished the farmer by the regularity with which he managed to do so. This field was a few acres of land located on the Longwood Plateau, The farmer, the emperor said to him, was making an attempt that will not succeed. The soil is too poor. Whether you plant oats, barley, or wheat there, the crop will fail. It shall be burned by the southeasterly winds that blow violently in this part of the island, to which it is exposed. Any planting on this plateau is impossible. The wind will burn and kill all vegetation. If I had gone to America, I would have gone into agriculture. I would have had taken care of my garden. I would have welcomed a few remnants of my army who would have come to join me, and we would have lived there together. This makes you laugh, Doctor. My tastes are simple, and I need little. I have always envied the fate of a good bourgeois in Paris, drawing a pension of 12,000 pounds, able to pursue his interests in the arts and letters. I add to that the pleasure of a family atmosphere, without which no happiness is possible, whatever class one belongs to. The emperor had learned through the newspapers that had arrived the day before the death of the King of Naples and that of Marshal Ney. This news had saddened him, and I heard him talking to Dr. O'Meara, which renewed this pain as he spoke. He said nothing about the King of Naples' wrongs towards him, adding that to go down to Calabria with 50 men was the action of a madman, but those who had ordered his death were monsters. As for Ney, his death was a crime. Louis XVIII and his exiles had used him to seek revenge for the shame of their flight. The time at which the emperor got up on St. Helena depended on how much rest he had gotten the previous night. Generally, he slept poorly. There were few nights when he did not go from one bed to another. If he asked me for his covered lamp, then he worked or read and went back to bed, waiting for daylight to arrive so he could get dressed and go riding. He had lunch when he came back, went back to bed, if he was tired enough to do so, took his bath at 2 o'clock. Using the hours he spent there to chat or to dictate it to one or the other of these gentlemen, then got out, dressed, and got into his carriage with the ladies and Countess Casas, followed by General Gourgaud on horseback. These were the emperor's habits during the first years of our stay at Longwood. They changed later due to his health. If he went to bed during the day, then the darkness had to be absolute. In the evening, when he went back into his apartment, which occurred regularly at 10 p.m., either he went to bed or wanted to chat with the person who had accompanied him. He would have his covered lamp taken into the adjoining room and chat with that person until he fell asleep or dismissed him, never exceeding a half hour or 45 minutes. The construction to house the emperor's retinue had been completed. General Gourgaud abandoned his uncomfortable tent to move into the lodging intended for him. Count de Montholon settled in his, and the room he had been occupying under the same roof as the emperor became the library. Countess Casas and his son changed their lodgings, but were not much better off than they had been. The emperor offered them the one that General Montholon had just left, but the count refused, finding that what he had been given was adequate. Since we had moved to Longwood, General Gourgaud was stricken with dysentery for the second time. This time the illness resisted treatment, and Dr. O'Meara informed the emperor, who immediately asked him if there was any danger. The emperor attributed the illness to General Gourgaud's having spent a prolonged amount of time under a tent since we had been at Longwood. Worried by alarming symptoms mentioned by the doctor, he expressed his desire that Dr. Whirling from the artillery be called in consultation. The admiral offered to have both the naval doctor as well as the town doctor sent. The thought of death connected with the general's critical condition saddened everyone in the colony. For 20 days, he made many people anxious. The garrison and the inhabitants of the island showed great concern for him. The emperor's affection and that of his companions in exile did not fail him either. It was a joyous day that marked his convalescence and also one of unity in all spirits. Part 5. Hudson Lowe. The Grand Marshal had left Hut's Gate to come live at Longwood, being as his house had been completed. The emperor would have liked to come along with Countess Bertrand to join him every evening at the family dinner, now that he lived closer. But Count Bertrand pointed out that his wife was generally in poor health, and the emperor knew she was never on time. He therefore asked permission to live in his new house as he had lived at Hut's Gate. The newspapers, brought by a store ship coming from England, gave the emperor an opportunity for distraction through Countess Casas's translation. The same newspapers announced that the governor of St. Helena, Sir Hudson Lowe, was about to leave England to go to his post. As a newspaper that had arrived in St. Helena The Morning Chronicle openly faulted the British ministry's conduct towards the emperor. It was deduced that the new governor would perhaps arrive with instructions to extend the prison to the entire island. He was expected quite impatiently, and with each ship that was announced, all wondered if it might be, perhaps, the Phaeton, the frigate on which it was known he had sailed. On April 14th, the emperor was about to go out in his carriage with the ladies when he was told by Colonel Bingham that the Phaeton was in sight. Leaving Colonel Bingham, the emperor changed the direction of his outing in order to see this frigate drop anchor in the Jamestown harbor. That same day, which could be called one of detestable remembrance, Lieutenant General Sir Hudson Lowe, his wife, and her 2 daughters from a previous marriage landed in St. Helena. During our stay in St. Helena, the older daughter married the Russian commissioner, Count Balmat. The governor's staff was composed of Sir Thomas Reed, Chief of Staff, Major Gorrick Kay, an aide, Lieutenant Colonel Lister, Inspector of the Militia, Major Emmett, and Lieutenants Wortham and Jackson of the engineers, these last 3 in charge of the construction of the new house, and Dr. Baxter, Inspector General of the hospital.